Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Modretro Chromatic. So this is an updated Game Boy or Game Boy Color, and it's been making some waves for both good and bad reasons. The good stuff is that it's a pretty unique Game Boy recreation. It's made out of metal and it'll play all of your Game Boy and Game Boy Color carts. And specifically, this thing is an FPGA for both Game Boy and Game Boy Color, so like an analog pocket but for only those two systems. Now the bad parts are kind of unique as well. Number one, this is made by Palmer Luckey, who is the creator of the Oculus Rift, but in between that time that he was making the Oculus Rift as well as now this Modretro Chromatic, he also is an arms dealer. And The Verge did a really excellent write-up about all the conflicts that come from buying this device. This is not typically something that you would usually have to deal with when buying a retro handheld. So I will leave that article linked down below. I do recommend reading it before you decide whether or not to pick one of these up. The other negative about the Chromatic is that all of these other color options, which I think are pretty unique, are all sold out, and they don't plan on making new ones. The only one you can find now is the gray one, which you can get at GameStop. And so we've got a lot to talk about here, not just this very unique handheld, but all of the circumstances that surround it. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we should start by talking about what is the Chromatic in the first place, and this essentially is a remade Game Boy. And like I mentioned, it is an FPGA or Field Programmable Gate Array, so it's going to be able to play your cartridges, and you'll also be able to use, something like an EverDrive as well. And the cycle accuracy on this one should be identical to the original Game Boy. We will test all of that later in this video. And so in reality, this is a lot more like an original Game Boy than any of those emulation devices I typically will cover on this channel. Now, I pre-ordered this thing, I think it was around last summer or fall, and it finally arrived right before Christmas. And it cost me $199 plus shipping, which I think was another $20. Inside the box, it'll come not only with the device, but also a copy of Tetris that was made specifically for this device. But of note, this cartridge will also work on the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and so it really is just a genuine cartridge, a new version of Tetris. And while there were a bunch of different color options that were initially available, those are all now sold out. So all you have left is the gray GameStop edition. And this one still looks pretty sharp, but I think it is definitely second fiddle to those color options. And unfortunately, they have no plans on making a new version of this device, although they have mentioned on social media that they do plan on making something, that they're basically taking all the lessons that they learned from making this device, and they're going to be coming out with something later on this year, or at least announced later this year. So at the very least, if you do want to get your hands on something from this company, it does look like you will have other options in the future. Now, taking a look at the box, this is one of those things that's actually pretty unique. I love the fact that it has this really nostalgic vibe to it. It's even got that look of like lined paper behind in the background, and yeah, I really like this. It's even got, that S thing that we all used to draw back in the day. Opening it up is also a unique experience. It just kind of flips open, and again, really nice design here. I like the fact that they took their time to really make this unique. Further inside, we've got the device itself, and this already came with that Tetris cartridge that I mentioned before, and then underneath that you will have 3 AA batteries. It's been a while since I first unboxed it, and unfortunately I didn't take video of that, so there might have been a USB-C cable here. I'm not really sure. Either way, that's about it as far as what you get inside the box, but again, this design is pretty cool. So let's go ahead and start with some impressions, and first thing is that this is made out of metal, so it's really sturdy feeling and quite chunky and heavy. To give you an idea, with the battery as well as a cartridge inside of it, it's 272 grams. This makes it a little bit lighter than the original Game Boy DMG, again with batteries and a cartridge inside, but it is quite a bit heavier than even my modded Game Boy Color, which obviously is made out of plastic. Now, my second impression was that this thing is quite thick. In fact, if you look here at the bottom, this is about the same thickness as the original Game Boy DMG, so it is very chunky. It also has a completely smooth texture here. Again, it's like a painted metal. It actually feels pretty good in terms of texture, but you can see there's no like ribbing or any sort of grip to it. It's just kind of sleek. The metal itself is cool to the touch and is a very sturdy and solid feeling product. In fact, there's no rattling whatsoever, no matter how much I shake it. It's kind of a unique design altogether because it has that boxy look and feel of the DMG, but then also a little bit more roundedness like the Game Boy Color. So it's kind of a mashup of the two. But I will say that just in holding it here, it almost feels like something that wasn't made by a game-making design company, but rather somebody who was just trying to get some really beautiful aesthetics. Thankfully, they did make it rounded in all the right parts, so it is comfortable to hold. unlike some other alternatives that look really nice, like, the Analog Pocket. This one also looks very beautiful, but is a little bit sharper in its edges, and so not quite as comfortable to hold. And we'll do a little bit more comparison between these two later in the video. For now, let's just keep talking about this design. Before we talk about controls, let's talk about some of this I/O. So we have a link cable slot right here. We've also got a lanyard hole, so if you want to connect this to something, you can. And then up top, we've got our on-off switch toggle, as well as our IR sensor. And again, this should function just like an original Game Boy Color. On the right side, we've got another lanyard hole, and then also our volume wheel. And this is just a nice little scroll wheel. It feels really satisfying. There is also one other button right here. This is our menu button. This one's a little bit stiff and hard to press down on, but you're not going to use this very often. On the bottom, we've got an LED indicator. This will go red when the battery gets low, and you also have a 3.5mm headphone jack, then also a USB-C port, and then we have one downward firing mono speaker. Now, in terms of audio, it is pretty loud. I would say it's not super loud, but I think it will be good enough for most use cases. So the audio here sounds nice and sharp, and it does come in through stereo. Now let's also test out the audio, and I'm going to point this directly at my microphone about 3 feet away. So I think the audio here is pretty decent, and it's obviously mono, but I still think it's pretty good, very classic sounding. And I do love that we have a volume wheel. It's very easy to rotate all the way up to max volume and then back down to mute. And so we've got everything in between as well. Now, this USB-C port is very interesting. They say it has video out, but that should have a huge old asterisk next to it. Number one, this is not your standard video out, so you cannot plug this into, say, for example, an HDMI adapter and then play it on a TV or monitor. Instead, the USB port is meant to be connected directly to a computer, kind of like a webcam. And unfortunately, trying to plug it into either a video capture card or directly into the computer didn't actually get me any sort of video out signal. So I'm not really sure what's going on when it comes to video out, but I was not able to get it to work. It definitely interfaces with the computer. It showed up in OBS as being the Modretro Chromatic, but I couldn't actually get any video in. Now, one thing I was able to do with this USB-C port is update the firmware. You can download that directly from their website. It's just a standalone app. Now, strangely, it was not able to detect the firmware on my device. It just asked me to update it anyway, which I did. And after going through the update, it again could not detect the firmware on my device. So I'm assuming I have the most recent firmware, but who knows? The USB-C port can also be used for power, which is kind of unique. Now, you wouldn't be able to use it to recharge batteries. You can see I've got some Amazon batteries in here, but if I had rechargeables, it will not recharge the batteries directly within here. But the unique thing is, if we take out the batteries and then we plug in a USB-C cable, and this can be any cable, any charger, everything seems to work for me, I can actually just turn it on and play it like this. And so I don't have to rely on batteries. I can actually use this wired. So this is actually kind of unique. If you're running out of batteries, what you can do is plug this in, and then the power is going to come from the cable. You can pull out your batteries, replace them with new ones, then pull out the cable, and you won't skip a beat when it comes to your actual game. So it's a nice little handy touch, but I think it would have been even better if they could go a step further and have the rechargeable batteries actually charge from the USB-C cable. Now, they said they're coming out with a rechargeable battery pack, but it's not on their website just yet. It says coming soon, and we don't know what the pricing is or timing or anything else like that. So there may be a time when you can actually charge this device from a USB-C cable, but not right now. You're going to have to use AA batteries, either just regular alkalines or rechargeables that you will have to charge separately. And then, of course, if you just want to play it wired, you could totally do that as well and not use any batteries at all. Now, the battery experience here is pretty unique. It only takes 3 batteries altogether, which is a little bit of an odd number, obviously, but I think it's kind of cool that we don't have to have a full 4 in here. And the back plate that they have for this thing is actually pretty cool because it's got this rubber kind of grip here. And so when you slide it in here, the batteries are not going to rattle around. In fact, it's very firm. There's a small latch right here that you will open up in order to get to the compartment, and it is really snug in place. And that's one of the things I really like about this, is that it's not rattling or anything else like that. Now let's take a look at the cartridge slot. And this is unique because, number one, the cartridges themselves don't actually go flush against the back of the shell. You can see that there's a little bit of a lip right here. Not the end of the world, but something that I kind of expected. And every kind of cartridge that you can think of, like an original Game Boy cartridge, that'll work fine. There's a bit of a lip, but yeah, it works. And so now finally, let's talk about these controls, and these are relatively unique and unexpected in some ways. Let's start with the start and select. So unlike the original Game Boy DMG, these are PBT plastic. So it's a hard plastic, but it does have a rubber membrane connection, so it does go down pretty easily. They are a little bit clacky, and that's also a similar story with these face buttons. These also have a little bit of a clacky sound. These are glossy and hard plastic, and then also are rubber membrane, much like with the other buttons, but you can just hear how clacky they are. They're quite loud. And so I think this is one of those devices that you probably wouldn't want to play in bed next to your significant other, unless, they're wearing earplugs or something, because this is quite loud. I think it's probably the metal on plastic that's clacking here. So yes, it is a quite loud device altogether. Now the D-pad is also kind of unique. It has a matte texture to it, so it feels nice and powdery, but then also is clacky as well. It's a rubber membrane, and it feels a little bit more tactile than the face buttons. It really bounces back. But in general, it does feel pretty good, but it does lack pivot. You can basically press down on this here in the center, and it's going to press down on all 4 directions at once. And that could wreak havoc on your gameplay, depending on the game that you're playing. And so, in terms of accuracy, if you wanted something that's exactly like the original Game Boy DMG or Color, this is not going to be it. I think for most people, especially casual users, this will be just fine. But if you are nitpicky about making sure you have a good pivot, this definitely doesn't have that. Let's do a quick test with Contra here on the Game Boy. And so what I'm going to do is press down on the D-pad, then rock it left and right. And you can see that, yes, my character can move quite a bit. It's not that the D-pad is pivoting. It's just that I can actually make it diagonal if I really push it on one side or the other. I think in terms of hitting diagonals, it's okay. Like I can actually go in each direction that I want to. It's a little bit more sensitive than I would like, but in general, when just going left and right and up and down, yeah, it seems to be pretty accurate for me. I think the big question here is whether or not, having a lack of pivot is going to affect any sort of game. It's really hard to see specifically which games are going to be affected by this. I think Link's Awakening is one of those where you don't want to press left and right at the same time. It can make a problem, but for the most part, I think for most people, it's going to be fine. The big problem is that this is geared towards Game Boy enthusiasts, and Game Boy enthusiasts are the kind of people who really notice a lack of pivot. And so if you are really nitpicky about that, you may want to stick with the original hardware. I would consider myself more of a casual user, and so for my just, general gameplay use case, it's been just fine. The only thing that's really kind of bothered me about just, the overall controls and the feeling of this device is just how clacky these buttons are, because they are quite loud. Okay, now let's talk about this screen. So this is basically a recreation of the original Game Boy Color screen. So 160 by 144 resolution, 10 by 9 aspect ratio, and 2.54 inches, again like the original. And so this is one of those unique things about the Modretro Chromatic. It knows exactly what it's supposed to be, which is a Game Boy and Game Boy Color. It's not like the Analog Pocket, which is just trying to, pick an aspect ratio and resolution that fits many different systems. Instead, this one is exactly just the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. The screen itself is really high quality. It's a sapphire crystal, which means it's going to be scratch resistant. It looks really nice. It is also IPS laminated, and it gets very, very bright. In fact, if we go into these settings here by pressing the menu, you can see that I'm at about maybe 40% brightness altogether, and you can adjust this by using the A and B buttons. It gets very bright. In fact, you can play this outdoors in direct sunlight, like I'm showing right here, and it's still playable, even with a dark screen like this Tetris game. And bear in mind, this is at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so direct sunlight, and it's still visible, which is pretty impressive. Now, in terms of the lowest brightness, it does get quite dim. In fact, you can see that you can't really see it right now. Even if I turn off the studio lights, it is a very dim screen. So you could play this one in the dark, but remember, these buttons are quite loud, so you may not want to play it in front of your significant other. While we're in here, let's talk a little bit about this menu, which you can just bring up and down by pressing this button on the side. Obviously, we have the brightness controls, and you can see at the bottom it also shows how much battery you have estimated remaining. And the battery life, by the way, will give you anywhere between like 8 to 4 hours, depending on how bright the screen is. It does seem like the brightness really does affect the gameplay. On average, I would say it's about 6 hours of battery life when you're playing at around 40% like I am, but if you're going to max it all the way out, you'll probably only get 4 hours. But if you play it in a really dim setting, like for example, the first bar right here, you can get upwards of 8 to 10 hours of gameplay. So the screen brightness really does affect your overall gameplay. Now, also in this first tab, we've got what they call silent mode. So if you turn this one on, when you use the volume wheel, it's not going to do anything. Now, if we go over one tab, we've got a couple other options. We've got frame blending as well as color correction. on. And frame blending will work with certain Game Boy Color games that use a special effect, but in general I would just recommend leaving this off, and then if you have any problems you can try turning it on. Now the color correction option is unique because you would think that, like emulation handhelds, if you turn it on it's going to mute the colors, but it does not do that. And if you go to the website, it just says that color correction is for use when streaming. And I'm not sure what that means, if that is supposed to do with the video out port that does not work currently or something coming in the future, but either way, I have not found this to have any actual use. On the next tab, we have the controls. Super handy if you don't know which one is A or B, but other than that, I don't think it's very useful. And then we have this system tab. And here it's going to show you the device firmware as well as the FPGA model firmware. And both of these are the most up-to-date, at least as far as I know. And really, that's about it when it comes to the software experience. You can basically just put in your cartridges and play them. It's a very simple experience. However, one thing worth noting is that when putting in a Game Boy cartridge and then trying to play it on this, it's going to default to colorization, and you may not want to have this. So what you'll have to do here is use the same old trick that you would use on the Game Boy Color, where you would actually press a combination of either the D-pad or the face buttons. They've got them all listed on their website, but you can also just experiment. So for example, if we press up and then turn it on, you will see that it's going to be a different color than it was before. Same thing if we press down, it's going to be a different color palette, and you can also do the same by using a combination of either A or B. For example, I know that left and B is grayscale, so you can hold left and B and then flip it on, and now it's going to be in gray. But the ones that I use the most is when you press both of these buttons and then left or right. And so right is the one that I usually do. So I press right and then the two buttons, and then I finally turn the device on. And this one gives me a more Game Boy DMG style look. You can also do the same with left in A and B. This one's going to be a little bit greener, but this one is also a little bit more classic in terms of just the overall palette. Personally, I think it's annoying that you have to remember color combinations in order to play original Game Boy games. But thankfully, it is somewhat easy to remember B and A plus right and then flipping it on. It's just a little bit awkward to actually do that in real life, to have to remember to press on a certain combination just to turn the device on in the first place when playing an original Game Boy game. Regardless, I think that the color palette here does look pretty good. It does give me a more nostalgic look and feel. Now you might be wondering whether or not EverDrive or multi-carts will work, and they should, just like any other original Game Boy. After all, this FPGA is mimicking that, and so you should be able to use any of those and then be able to navigate through. So for example, here I'm using just a generic one that I got for like $20, $25 on AliExpress, and let's try it again. Let's do Dragon Warrior 3, and it'll take a minute to start up like with any other multi-cart cartridge, but yeah, it should work. And so there we go. We've now got Dragon Warrior 3 running on this Game Boy multi-cart. And so, yeah, if you want to play basically any Game Boy or Game Boy Color game, it's all within the realm of possible if you use one of these flash carts. But otherwise, you can just also use your original cartridges. Now, I do have other flash carts, including the Easy Flash Junior, and I found that my success rate with these ones are not quite as good. They're a little bit finicky. So for example, with this one, when I turn it on, you'll see an Easy Flash thing, and then it'll make some sort of garbled stuff, and then it just gives me a white screen, so it does not get into the menu. At first, I thought there was something wrong with my flash card because, yeah, it just keeps doing that no matter how many times I try to reseat the cartridge. But the thing is, I've got a Game Boy Color here with an original PCB. It has been modded with a new shell and a new battery pack, but it's still the original Game Boy Color. And when I turn this one on, it actually works just fine. And so I think there is something going on with that FPGA. It's not quite compatible. Now, one flash card that works pretty well with the Modretro Chromatic is the EverDrive. It's a little bit finicky, and sometimes the games will not boot, but you can see here that I am running Tecmo Bowl just fine. But it can also be temperamental. For example, here, I just turned it on again, and it's just showing me OS initializing, and it's been stuck here for about a minute at this point. And so yes, the EverDrive is a little bit more temperamental than the other ones, and so it will work sometimes, but it really is going to be a luck of a draw, and I never know anytime that I open it up whether or not it's going to actually work. Like you could see this time, it gave me a disk read error. Other times, it'll tell me that the firmware has not been included on the card, and so it just has a hard time reading things altogether. So when it comes down to it, much like with other FPGA systems that I've tried before, it's the cheaper one that actually works the best because, I don't know, this one has fewer features or a different power draw, but this one, which cost me I think $20 or $25 on AliExpress, is the most consistent of all the flash carts that I own. And again, this is going to be a non-issue if you're just going to be playing original cartridges. And so the big thing here is just to remember that button combination when you actually turn it on so you can get a nice DMG effect. But personally, I have not been playing a lot of original Game Boy Boy games. Instead, I've just been playing that new version of Tetris that comes with this device. I think it's a nice looking cartridge altogether, and the software in it is also really nice. It has all the things that I would want in a classic Tetris game. So you do have the ability to do single player as well as multiplayer via the link cable, and you also have multiple different options in terms of making different profiles for different people, and then you have other types of gameplay as well. Personally, I only play Marathon, but you've got, your Ultra and Sprint and Endless gameplay as well. Inside the settings, you can pick what level you start out at. It'll show you your highest score, and there are some other options as well. So you've got quite a few things that you can adjust within this Tetris game. It also has all of the gameplay features that I love to have in a modern game. So if I press up, it'll immediately go down. I can press select and put it into the hold as well. And so those two features are something that I really enjoy and were not present in the original version of Tetris. And so I like the fact that it's been slightly updated. I like the fact that the Tetraminos are also colored. And so, yeah, this has been a really excellent Tetris experience. And unfortunately, I think the only way that you can get this version of Tetris is by buying the console, because even though they do sell some games on their website, this is not one of the games that are listed. So it is kind of ironic that I think the best element of this $200 console is this one cartridge, which I can play on any of my Game Boy devices, that runs really, really well. Now, one of the big factors when it comes to a device like this, especially when it's FPGA, is going to be accuracy and whether or not it actually plays in terms of timing exactly like an original Game Boy. So to gauge this, I did a very simple test. I basically took 5 different devices and then played Super Mario Land, the first level, and I tried to start all of the games at the exact same moment, and then let the timer run out, and then saw how long it takes for them to be as accurate as the original Game Boy. So starting on the left, we have the Analog Pocket, another FPGA console. Then after that, we've got the Modretro Chromatic, and then of course right there dead in the center, we've got my original Game Boy DMG. To the right of that, I have what they call the FPGBC. So this is also an FPGA console, but directly made for the Game Boy Color and Game Boy. And then finally, on the far right, I've got the Anbernic RG40XXV. And this one is an emulation console, so no bones about it, this one is running via software. Now, the thing about Super Mario Land seconds is that they're a lot faster than regular seconds, so the timer just kind of flies by really quickly. But I did find that at the end of the level, the FPGBC as well as the 40XXV, so the two devices on the right, finished about 3 Mario seconds faster than the other 3. And the other 3 did finish at the exact same time. So in terms of cycle accuracy, I would argue that yes, the Modretro Chromatic is exactly like the original Game Boy, and same thing with the Analog Pocket. And so those I would consider to be true FPGA systems in that they have the exact same timing as the original cartridge. Something like the FPGBC has the ability to change the timing, but it's never 100% accurate. It's either a little bit too slow or a little bit too fast. Meanwhile, with an emulation device like the Anbernic RG40XXV, you're not going to have those same timings at all. It's going to be about the same as the FPGBC. When it comes down to it, all of these devices feel very good, and I enjoy playing Game Boy games on them, but I would say that the 3 on the left are definitely more accurate. Now, as far as which ones I prefer to play these types of games, it might surprise you. My favorite is the FPGBC, specifically for Game Boy and Game Boy Color. I made a whole video about this, but it all boils down to the fact that this one actually feels like a Game Boy Color, and it's also rather cheap, less than $90, and you can customize it. Different button colors, different shells, all that kind of stuff. And so I've often called this thing my favorite Game Boy, and that's why. Now, the Anbernic device is amazing in its own way because it obviously can emulate many other systems. So not only does it work great with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but you could use it for, NES and Genesis and Super Nintendo, PS1, and stuff like that. The Analog Pocket is no slouch either because this one is an FPGA system that can play a wide variety of consoles, including, home consoles like Super Nintendo, but even arcade cores. And so this is a really nice FPGA machine that can do well more than Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Long story short, you've got many different ways to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, either through FPGA or emulation. The real question comes down to whether or not the Modretro Chromatic is the one for you. And so let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Modretro Chromatic to help you when you're making that decision. So let's start with what I like. And number one is the fact that this feels very sturdy and solid. There are actually some marketing materials from this company where they show it being run over with a car and still surviving. And I can definitely attest to the fact that that yes, it feels like it's built like a tank. It also has a nice screen. Obviously, it's not a super high resolution, but it works out just fine for Game Boy and Game Boy Color. The screen also gets very bright and very dim, so it's a really nice experience. The cycle-accurate gameplay is also probably a big draw for people who want to have the timings exactly like an original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. That's one of the beauties of FPGA. And I also like the initial color options that we had with the first edition. I was able to pick one of these up because I pre-ordered it on that first day, but now unfortunately it is sold out everywhere. So this is definitely something that was pretty cool back, when it was first available to order, but not quite so cool now that we only have a gray color option. So let's move on and talk about some of the other things that I don't like about this device. And the first is that it is rather loud and clacky. I think the controls are actually relatively decent when it comes down to it, but I definitely enjoy myself more when I'm playing alone in a room as opposed to with somebody else around. The D-pad pivot could potentially be an issue for you as well. It depends on the game that you're playing. Personally, I didn't find any issues when I was playing games, but I know that there are some sticklers out there, and if you're one of those people, you may not like this. The video out capability was kind of confusing too, because I could not get this to work. It's supposed to work as a webcam, but none of the software that I tried actually would make it work. Another thing I would have loved to see in terms of functionality is the ability to charge rechargeable batteries via the USB-C port, so that way you're not having to get in and out of that back compartment. As it stands, it is pretty easy to change out the batteries, and you can even keep it powered on via USB-C as you do so. But I think that one extra step of being able to charge the batteries within would have been pretty awesome. And then finally, I couldn't finish out this video without bringing up again the potential ethical concerns of buying from somebody like Lucky Palmer. Now, I'm not going to go as far as to saying that the money that you're going to purchase with this device is going to go towards weapons that are going to be used on innocent civilians or any of that kind of stuff, but it's usually a conflict that you don't have to think about when you buy a retro handheld. And I fully acknowledge that we don't know where our money is going with many of these devices. If you think about like an Ambernick device made by a Chinese company, who knows where that money is going in terms of their taxes and whatnot. So I don't want to get on a high horse or a soapbox about this, but if you are having any sort of conflicts about, buying this device and the politics or anything else related to it, I do think it is worth doing your research. I'm not pointing you in one direction or another, but I will leave that Verge article down below because it did give me a little bit of pause as I was reading it myself. And again, it is something that is really unique to kind of consider that you have to think about the political implications of buying a handheld like this. It's just not something that you would usually factor in when playing Tetris. In the end, this was kind of a hard review for me to make, not because of all that stuff we were just talking about, but really the fact that you cannot get this device other than that one retail unit, and who knows how long that one's actually going to last as well. If we had, something like this yellow one, which I think is pretty awesome looking, and I could give people a link and say, hey, this is where you can buy it from, I think it might be a different story. But this is kind of turning into a video where I'm saying, hey, look what I have, and you can't get it. And I never really like making videos like that, where I'm kind of showing off a device that you cannot purchase. I'm trying to just help people buy something that really is going to be a good match for them. And even though this yellow one might be a great match for you, you're not going to be able to buy it. So as of making this video, when it comes down to it, if you like the gray one, then yes, take all of this stuff into consideration. Otherwise, this has just been a fun video to see in terms of just what was actually made and how it all turned out. Now, because this device did sell so well, I fully expect to see other Modretro devices in the future, maybe a Game Boy Advance version. I know that Lucky Palmer is a big Nintendo 64 fan as well, so maybe we'll see something along those lines. At the end of the day, even if you are interested in picking up that gray model and you think the color is just fine, I do have a hard time recommending it, and that's because it is $200. And that $200 will essentially just give you a pretty good Game Boy and Game Boy Color experience and really nothing else. And if you are a Game Boy and Game Boy Color enthusiast and you want something that's very cycle accurate and you want something that's one and done, then yes, I can see this one being a potential option. But for people who are a little bit more cost conscious, I would recommend the $87 FPGBC. This one will give you very similar gameplay and also plays all your cartridges and is a lot cheaper and a lot more customizable. And if you do have $200+ burning a hole in your pocket, then I think the Analog Pocket might actually be a better deal. This one will again play your cartridges, including Game Boy Advance, plus some others with adapters, and you can also play a bunch of other games from the SD card. And so in terms of FPGA handhelds, I would much rather play on my Analog Pocket. This one's just a lot more fun to work with. You can do all sorts of tinkering, play other systems, and things like that. I recently did an updated review video of the Analog Pocket. I'll leave it linked down below in case you're more interested in hearing about this one. And then finally, if you're not overly concerned about accuracy and you don't mind emulation, then I think something like the RG40XXV is probably going to be an overall better choice when it comes to your money. This thing costs anywhere from $60 to $70 and is an emulation handheld. You can throw all sorts of different firmwares on it. You can try all sorts of different systems and whatnot. There's just many other things that you can do with this device. And of course, because it's emulation, that means you can do other things like save states and cheats and fast forward, all those things that you can kind of enjoy with software emulation. And so bang for your buck, I think the Anbernic is better. But if you want something very accurate and really unique, then I could see the Chromatic being an option as well. And so in the end, I've probably given you enough data at this point to understand whether or not the Modretro Chromatic is going to be a good choice for you. It's really going to come down to whether or not you plan on playing with cartridges and you want something that's just like a modern Game Boy or Game Boy Color with a nice metal shell. And so in those regards, then yeah, I could see this being worthwhile. But for everybody else, I would say that an emulation handheld or even the Analog Pocket might be a better deal. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick one of these up? Do you have any interest in it, or would you rather play on something else? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.